Good evening, Tom. How are you?
I'm well, Simon. How are you?
I'm fantastic.
For the sake of the listeners, Simon's looking very well tanned. And he only looks half if he's 120 years of age.
I'm thriving here. This is my last night on foreign soil. We'll be back to Glasgow this week on Wednesday we return. I hear it's quite cold back there just now.
Well, is
7 or
that what
8.
it was? I heard there was a pipe band rehearsing at Glasgow Airport to welcome you back.
It's probably the Crime Time Inc. fans at Glasgow Airport. Don't you expect the same thing at Edinburgh Airport in future, though?
I think I think it's very doubtful they'd all get into Glasgow Airport. But
It'll be like the Beatles. Did you not call me the fifth Beatle at one point?
I did. That's one of the many things I've called you. Yeah, that's what I've publicly called you. Behind your back, I've called you other things, but we'll not. Since it's a Sunday night, we'll not.
Yeah, be charitable. I'm looking forward to some real live banter, Tom, when we get together. 2 gigs we've got coming up in March. The first one in the Mitchell Library in Glasgow.
And funnily enough, I saw some photographs of that. It looks a super venue. I'm really looking
it looks
forward
nice.
to it. The sophisticated intellectual side of Glasgow. I had no idea it would be so big.
There's lots of things about Glasgow you've got to learn yet, Tom.
There is, and I look forward to it.
Yep. And then that's the Thursday night, and the following Thursday we're in the Three Craws. It's at Jordan Hill, just across the road from Jordan Hill train station. The story with that is that when my daughter was ill the last couple of years of her life, sometimes the hospital at Garnavel would let her out for an hour or so to go out for a bit of fresh air, and we would nip round to the Three Craws. That was our favourite haunt because it was quite handy. Mm-hmm. And she actually made me promise to go every month, and I still do go every month. I need to go on the 28th on Thursday when we get back to make sure I've been there. And I was there on the 1st of January, so that's how tight it's been. But that's our venue. It'll be our first kind of public house one that we're doing. It's a restaurant come public house, but it'll be quite interesting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that too, and I'm looking forward to seeing the crowd because you've spoken so much about it.
Is Jane Hamilton going to be joining us at all?
I hope, yes. She's coming to the Mitchells.
Okay.
I'm not sure I've spoken to her about the other one, but I will. I'm sure if she can, she will.
We'll need to be nice to her at the Mitchell.
Yeah, that would be handy. If you can raise yourself to that, that would be good.
How's the plans coming for your book launch, Tom? Any news on that front?
Yeah, it's very good. I'm just, funnily enough, this afternoon I was just putting finishing touches to the launch press release. We've got the contract for printing, so it's looking very good. I think we'll press the big red button to go to the printers probably tomorrow.
Wow.
The PDF is all cleared. Various events for that one, lunches and lectures, and I think I've got 6 lectures lined up for it. It's going to be a very busy summer.
Lectures will suit you down to the ground, Tom, because the lectures are where nobody gets to ask you questions or answer back. You just tell them.
On the contrary, it's interactive. It's going to be very interactive, particularly the launch. I'm not going to give any secrets away. I'm going to take the launch attendees right back to the year 1940. Yeah.
Brilliant. Right. Sounds good. I'll be there heckling as usual. That's my job. Tom, the deep dive team have been busy this week, but they've caught up a wee bit because this really should have been in last week's show, as you pointed out earlier. It was the St. Valentine's Massacre in 1920s Chicago, the bootleggers, the middle of prohibition, alcohol prohibition, and all the rest of it.
Yep.
I know that you were quite keen to get your teeth into this one.
Yes, because it's a very important crime. And when St. Valentine's, I always think about the Chicago St. Valentine's Day Massacre. When I was working in America, I worked very closely with a guy from Chicago Police Department, and he had a whole historic artifact, a whole file about the St. Valentine's Day shooting, including original crime scene photographs and all the rest of it.
Wow.
And because of that, what basically happened, and the deep divers have been through it, so I'm not going to go over it again, but basically it's a face-off between Alphonse Capone, the famous Al Capone, and Bugsy Moran, who was his rival. And there'd been various attempts on Capone's life, but Capone decided to really go for it, and he laid a trap to murder Bugsy Moran and all his henchmen in one go. And this happened in the famous garage in Chicago, where Moran and his men were lured there under false pretenses to be attacked. And of course, Tragically, no plan goes right. We've often discussed that.
Yeah,
No plan
yeah.
survives contact with reality. And Moran didn't show up. He was late. Now, whether he had prior knowledge or what it was, we will never know. But Moran was not amongst the people who were murdered. But it was a brutal business. Thompson submachine guns, 45
Yeah.
caliber Tommy guns, shotguns. And the 7 men were left lying dead. I've seen the crime scene photographs, all lying in a row, all shot dead, and their hats lying in blood all over the place.
It was a kind of firing squad, wasn't it? Lined them up. And,
Yeah, that's
and
right.
blasted them.
I think they probably thought they were going to be lined up to be disarmed.
Yes.
In fact, they were lined up and they were shot. Now, 3 things came from this. Firstly, the crime was treated with such horror that no more Mr. Nice Guy, something had to be done. There had been gang warfare and roundabout bootlegging ever since Prohibition had come in, but this was beyond the pale. And so the relatively new FBI were given the task, J. Edgar Hoover, the director, were given the task of sorting this out. The approach he took was to develop the anti-racketeering laws called RICO. And RICO stands for Racketeering, Infringements and Corrupt Organisations. In other words, racketeering. And that's been a centrepiece of federal law enforcement in America ever since, really, and hugely powerful. And you'll remember we talked about this in regard to the FIFA inquiry just recently.
Yes.
It's an immensely powerful tool. And the RICO tactic against anti-racketeering came in as a direct result of the St. Valentine's Day shooting. So that's number 1. Number 2, it also was the birth of ballistics, because what they did was, for the first time, they took the slugs from the bodies, the 45 caliber slugs from the bodies of the deceased men, who were all petty gangsters themselves, although some of them were middle-class men who had lost their jobs in the Depression and had taken to bootlegging as easy money. None of them were innocent bystanders. They took the 45 caliber slugs and managed to detect individual and quite unique striation marks on the slugs, which matched them to 2 Tommy guns, which they subsequently recovered. That was the birth of forensic ballistics. And you'll remember I've spoken at length about the great Percy Sillitoe, Ural chief, who used the Ruxton case to further the cause of forensic science. Well, J. Edgar Hoover did exactly the same with this. J. Edgar Hoover did exactly the same. What he did was he promoted the whole business about forensic science, scientific methods, on the back of this case. And you'll remember, I've told you the story, how J. Edgar Hoover and Percy Sillitoe met in 1931 at a conference in Chicago. They became firm friends, and thereafter you can see their tactics of using notable cases to promote their ideology both grow. Because Al Capone became almost like a showbiz figure. And you'll see pictures of him. And of course, once you stick your head above the parapet, there's only one thing sure, you're going to get shot off. And that's eventually, of course, what happened to Al Capone. He was prosecuted for tax evasion under RICO. He was imprisoned, and that was the end of him. And Al Capone became, and there's some fantastic old interviews of Capone. And he comes out with some great sayings. My favourite is he used to say, you get a lot further with a kind word and a gun than you do with a kind word. And that's got to be one of the great truths, you know. Following on St. Valentine's Day, 2 years later, in 1931, there was a Hollywood film called The Public Enemy, and that was James Cagney. James Cagney's entered the golden screen, the silver screen, as the gangster with a Tommy gun. And that gave birth to really a whole genre of gangster movies. Cagney was the top man, but there was various others, all very pastiche things. And so the St. Valentine's Day killings really was the start of the celebrity gangster. We've spoken about celebrity gangsters in our knowledge and in Scotland here, and just what a misnomer it is. But this was the start of it, the St. Valentine's Day shooting. So it's a hugely consequential crime, and it's very interesting we should talk about it for these reasons.
and laid the foundations for The Godfather and all the rest to come, where it's all romanticised and made for Hollywood, isn't it?
Well, absolutely.
Where the bad guys become the good guys.
Oh yeah, and after that, you had other celebrity gangsters. You've got Machine Gun Kelly, Bonnie and Clyde. You've got all these people who become tabloid celebrities as they rampage about the place, killing, maiming, and robbing. The St. Valentine's Day shootings really started that.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Tom. It's great to have you on here that can remember these things from the 1930s. It's funny how we see things from different aspects, because I immediately latched on to Prohibition.
Yeah.
And was thinking that what we did with Prohibition, drugs, is exactly what happened in the 20s and created that vacuum of a product that's in demand. People wanted it, and we make it illegal. So all we've done is created a black market. But the extension of that, if you like, was that how do you combat that? Because once you've got that black market and people like Capone and Moran and all these guys, they've got power, they've got money, they've got political influence, and they've also got the power of corruption because of the amount of money that they're making. So it's a horrible cesspit and a spiral downwards. How do you break that? We spoke about this just a couple of weeks ago with instance in housing schemes and things like that. You have to bring strangers in. You have to bring cops in, authority in that has no history with these people and can't be corrupted by them. And Elliot Ness was the obvious stick out here, along with Sean Connery.
That's right. St. Valentine's Day was one good case in point. The argument that J. Edgar Hoover always made was that it couldn't be left to the local cops. And that's why the racketeering laws were federal laws for the federal agencies like the FBI.
One of the templates for combating racketeering would be that you bring in a squad that's got nothing to do with that geographical area.
Absolutely. The truth of the matter was there was so much money in bootlegging that there was corruption within the Chicago Police Department, that they had people who would tell them what was happening, etc.
Yeah.
And that's another factor, you're quite right, about illegal substances which are in demand. Once you close the door on one, they'll find another. And funnily enough, I was thinking about you earlier this week. I try not to think about you very much, Simon, but I was thinking about you earlier this week because there's a suggestion that some of the drug dealers in Scotland now are starting to trade in illegal Ozempic, the slimming drug.
Oh, yeah.
Which is much in demand, which you cannot get, and therefore there's a black market being established in that, along with all the other kinds of drugs. So, and I hate to say it, but it does actually support your argument about illegal substances and about black markets.
Yeah, because criminals are criminals, and they don't care who they're selling to. They don't care what they're selling, which is a big part of the issue as far as drugs are concerned, because nobody's got a clue what they're buying and putting into their veins or into their bloodstream. So the arguments against prohibition are strong in that respect, but that doesn't mean there's going to be a vacuum. We need to regulate this thing properly and take control away from them.
One of my problems, and you know this, I agree with most of what you think and say, but my reservation is if you legalise and regulate certain substances, what's the illegal market going to do? How are they going to respond? What are they going to move to? And this unknown concerns me. But listen, on another note, I know you've been away from the holiday for a long, long time. When you come back, I can see by looking at you, you've put on a few stones. Don't, Simon, don't go to the illegal market and buy Ozempic. Please don't do it.
I was just about to ask, is there any information about where you can
source
this?
No, don't. I'll tell you what, I've got some very good advice for you, Simon. Just shut your pie hole. Don't eat it. Don't eat it. Walk by that pie.
We could start another Tom's slimming advice. Shut your pie hole. Very good.
Anyway, that was a great case. And as I say, there's a lot more to be said and written about St. Valentine's Day because we treat it on the surface. It was a gangster shooting. But what we don't often think about is what all the other consequences were that came from it.
Yeah. And that's true of a lot of the cases this week that the deep dive team have been looking at, Tom. It's because of these cases sometimes that doors are closed and regulations come in and how we evolve the law as we move along, because the criminals are always evolving as well and thinking of new ways just like they'll do if we did deal with regulation for the drugs. There's no question they're not going to sit back and say, oh, I'd better get a job now. That's never going to happen.
No.
So the next case was a lot closer to home, of course, in London. And again, it was a national scandal. It was an absolute shocker for the whole nation. The murder of Jill Dando on her doorstep at 11:30 in the morning. April 1999. It doesn't seem that long ago either, 26 years, Tom. But it was a horrific case, wasn't it, that shocked everyone?
Yeah, Jill Dando, I met Jill Dando. I did a thing on Crime Watch about the World's End murders, and I met Jill Dando then, and she was a lovely girl, charming lady. I also have a little bit of knowledge about this case because I knew someone who was on the original inquiry team, the deputy SIO in the original inquiry team. Let me lay out my thoughts right from the start. I think Barry George killed Jill Dando. And I'll tell you why I think that. He was an obsessive who lived near Jill Dando. His room was a shrine to Jill Dando with photographs all over the place. He was known to have messed about with replica guns and was photographed with one of these guns. There was a belief that she was shot at very close range with a projectile from a replica gun. In other words, it didn't have the velocity of a real firearm.
Okay.
For all these reasons. Now,
and he was convicted, Tom.
He was convicted, and then the Court of Criminal Appeal released him on the basis of the firearms residue evidence was not sufficiently strong. And I can understand that. And I remember the debate at the time. In hindsight, and it is in hindsight, they could have tried to build a more compelling circumstantial case to support the main thrust of evidence, right?
Yeah.
And they thought they had enough, and they did have enough. But the Court of Criminal Appeal rejected it, found it was an unsafe conviction, and nothing more has been done about it in regard to the double jeopardy, etc. And of course, that spawned a whole lot of amateur detectives and TV journalists and all that nonsense about it being
Serbian hitman and all that.
Serbian hitman. Just because she was a television anchor. If these countries were to kill every television presenter, the bodies would be littered in the streets. I'm trying to be dispassionate about this. I'm trying to be objective about it. I know some of the guys who were involved in the case, but looking at the evidence in the round that I have seen, okay, I still think Barry George has got a case to answer.
The thing for me, Tom, was that he was charged. You and I know that nobody gets as far as being cautioned and charged and put to court without the police having what they believe is a case against them. And the Crown, in this case, the prosecution service, agreed and went to trial. What you're saying is that they were maybe a bit premature in doing that and could maybe have dug a bit more round about the circumstances, maybe got a wee bit more to secure it. We'll never know what he said when he was interviewed, if he gave an alibi or where he had been or anything like that. But there's always more can be done. And if they had done that, they might well have managed to keep the conviction. It said in the deep dive that there was concerns about contamination. Did that mean anything to you, Tom?
Well, the firearm particles, they were very small, minor, and they were in a pocket of a jacket. So how could they have got there? Could there have been some crossover contamination from other sources? That was the seed of doubt that was sown in the minds of the appeal court. But listen, Simon, I'll tell you what, I know some of the individuals involved in it, one particularly well, and I have no doubt it was as good an investigation as it could have been. This is not a case of Jill Dando was shot and they locked up the guy the next day. I mean, it was a long, long time, and it was a painstaking investigation. So it wasn't a premature. Now, in hindsight...
Well, he was convicted.
Yeah,
he was convicted in 2001, Tom, so that was 2 years after the case.
And so it's easy for us in hindsight. We here, we're not the last people, the very last people. I'm the last person to be throwing stones in hindsight. I don't want to do that. I'll leave that to the amateur psychologists and the amateur detectives who've never actually been there. I think it was a good investigation. I think it was a little bit perverse of the appeal court, given all the other evidence, to be honest. But the problem was that
And a jury had obviously found him guilty. A jury had seen it.
The firearm residue was perhaps treated as more important as a mainstay of evidence rather than be a supporting evidence. I think it was Barry George. There we go.
Me too. No smoke without fire and all that stuff. The thing is, with an investigation so high profile, Tom, it couldn't be any more high profile. She was so well known. She was a household name.
Yep.
Murdered on her doorstep with the keys of her house in her hand. It was horrific. In the morning, in broad daylight. It couldn't be any more horrific. As a senior officer, as a senior investigating officer, there's obviously pressure applied from all quarters, from the media, from politicians, from all angles. How do you cope with that as an investigating officer? Do you have to switch off from it, or is it a coping mechanism?
You must partition yourself. You must have a very strong communications team working with you to protect you.
Right.
Because if you start getting driven by the press, Bible John is the best example in our local history here. Bible John is a perfect example of an investigation which was hijacked and driven by the media, to the great detriment of the investigation and to the great detriment of many of the very fine detectives, and there were fine detectives who worked on that case. So you've got to build a barrier there, and you've got to take yourself off, and you've got to stay dispassionate. But you're right, I mean, Jill Dando was the girl next door. She was everybody's sweetheart and all the rest of it. And yeah, there was a horror. The pressure must have been absolutely immense. But you have to adopt systems where you protect yourself from that.
Yeah. And your team. Yeah.
And your team. You start to react instead of being in control and steering the car. You start to have to react to the media. And once that begins, then you're chasing your tail and you're in deep, deep trouble. Deep trouble. Yeah. And of course, that's what happened to Bible John.
Okay, Tom, that's it. Fascinating insight for us. Thanks for doing that for our Crime Time Inc. listeners. Let's have a wee advert there. I think that's an appropriate point.
Yeah.
Tom, our next case was quite refreshing because not even you will have been involved or know anyone that was involved in this, because you've usually got a link for us when you knew such and such that worked with such and such. But 1692 is maybe stretching it a wee bit. And we're going back to the States again for the Salem Witch Trials, which I thought was a fascinating example. One thing that came out of it really strongly for me was this type of evidence. You're always talking on here about evidence. And this is the type of evidence that I relied on a lot in the Serious Crime Squad through in Strathclyde, was spectral evidence. Did you ever use that through in Edinburgh?
No, I didn't. But you know what? When I was listening about spectral evidence, evidence of dreams and visions, I thought, that's it. That's where it came from. That's Strathclyde Serious Crime Squad in the 1990s, spectral evidence. And also confession by torture. And I mean, I had no idea that you guys had taken your lead from such a historic case. And can I just say to the listening audience today that if you want to learn more about spectral evidence and confession by torture and dreams and visions, then you can do no worse than read Simon MacLean's excellent memoir, The 10%. The 10%, ladies and gentlemen, which is available in the fairy tales section of all good charity shops. The 10%. No, spectral evidence. Simon, I thought of you straight away. Spectral evidence, wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
Tom, I wish I'd got you to write the back of it now, the blurb on the back of it. It's been so much better.
When you actually get time away from holidays, Simon, and you write something else, then I'll be very happy to do a critique of it. Trust me, I'll be happy.
Tom, if you ever write a bestseller like that, you'll be on holiday as well. Don't worry about it. Oh dear, spectral evidence is a crack. I suppose we should explain. Well, they'll have listened to it during the week from our deep dive team. This is the Salem Witch Trials, which shows the route that society can go down. I know it's 300 years ago, but when people get beliefs and indoctrinated and the narrative becomes twisted and they decide that someone's got to be guilty somewhere. And this was young girls that were suffering symptoms and were being executed as they were suspected of being witches. And it all turned out to be probably food poisoning, Tom, at the end of the day.
Food poisoning and mass hysteria and power of the church, overweening power of the church, lack of checks and balances, lack of a justice system. And the most terrible, terrible, no balance of fairness, nothing. We had these witch trials, perhaps not as big or not as famous, because, of course, the Salem Witch Trials were the source of Arthur Miller's famous play, The Crucible, which was, still reckoned to be one of the finest pieces of writing in the 20th century. But we had exactly the same, and the root causes were the same. It's mass hysteria, it's a corruption of religion, it's a corruption of power, and it's the lack of checks and balances. Now, we've just been talking about Jill Dando and just slightly bemoaning the fact that the appeal court took the decision they did over Barry George. That's the downside. But the upside is that you need these checks and balances to protect yourself from corruption like happened in the Salem witch hunts. And fascinating case of mass hysteria. And as you say, a simple thing like food
And it's
poisoning.
that due process that, yes, we bemoaned it in the job and still do sometimes. And I've heard you speak about jury trials on here and on certain cases that we've discussed, that they really are the best system we've got.
Yep.
And you're not always going to get the result that you want. Tom, did I make this up, or did the lab used to have safety measures in place as well, that they would give a 10% benefit of the doubt, if you like, including with drunk driver blood samples and things like that they would always give a 10% benefit of the doubt to the accused?
It wasn't always 10%,
Right.
but there was a margin of safety. Yes, there was a margin of safety.
Yeah.
And that's quite right too. And it was the same with
Speeding,
with speeding cases and all the rest of it. There was always a margin of safety. No better example of that is the standard of evidence for fingerprints. Because the world's experts tell you that if there's 12 points of comparison on a fingerprint, you're talking about the same person. But yet the law demands 16. And that's exactly what you're talking about. That's that margin of safety, the benefit of the doubt. So time and time again, I've had people come to me, fingerprints guys come and say, it was him, boss. We've got 13 points, but we don't have 16, so we can't use it as evidence. So they're absolutely sure it was him or her, but 16 points is the standard of evidence. And I mean, there's been times when they said, can we not produce it as a sort of a piece of information? No. It's either 16 points or it's not.
You mentioned the torture there as well, and I hope you were tongue-in-cheek. But that pressure, I was thinking about that when I was listening to our deep dive team. And when someone's in custody, they're under a lot of pressure. When they're brought in by the CID, they're brought in. Sometimes that pressure is very much deliberate. They're brought in and not told very much. They're cautioned. They're left maybe to sweat for an hour or so, whether you go and speak to a witness or search a house or a car or whatever it might be. So the pressure's building all the time, and it's something that detectives have to be very careful of, isn't it? That you don't get a false confession because of that pressure.
Yes, you can. And of course, there's various famous stated cases to protect people. The Chalmers case at Shemay v. Chalmers, famous, I think it was 1953 stated case about a confession given by a laddie who was a wee bit immature. Very good example of that, where you really have to be very, very careful that you're not getting false confessions. And you and I have dealt with half-witted, and I use the word in the kindest possible way, half-witted laddies who would confess to anything. But immediately you find out they weren't there at all.
Or it might be the truth. But I'm thinking of safeguarding here. It's now a feature of interviews and whatnot. If there's any policemen out there that are not very conscious of that safeguarding, then they're out on a limb, because it's going to be tested at court whether the accused was aware of what was going on, was fit to answer the questions that you were answering, and wasn't under undue pressure. That's all going to be tested in the court. So you have to cover all these bases now when you bring someone in to interview them about anything.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Funnily enough, I'm watching a series of programmes just now on television called Unforgotten, and it's actually about cold case investigations, which of course I'm interested in, as you know. And it's actually very, very good. And what I like about it, Simon, is it's technically right. It's correct. They've done their homework, and I hats off to them. But one of the things they're doing, that's exactly one of the people they're dealing with is a boy of low mental capacity, and it's going into all this business about a responsible adult, somebody to make sure that they're being dealt with fairly. It's very pertinent, as you say.
Yeah, because it can ruin the case. It can have the case thrown out before it even gets to the court. So the thing about the Salem was that the principle that we all know and everyone knows is innocent until proven guilty. But that was the exact opposite in Salem, wasn't it? They were guilty and had to then prove their innocence, which is absolutely impossible to do.
I know, but I was interested in the story. There's one girl who comes out very strongly, who just recognises the whole thing as a load of nonsense and just will not interact with it at all. And throughout history, you come across these people of just remarkable courage, They're just not going to be swayed. They're not going to give some false confession. They're not going to take an easy way out. They're just going to face it down and say, this is a load of nonsense.
If you'd ever worked in the west of Scotland, you'd come across these people all the time, Tom, but maybe not so much in the east.
Spectral evidence. Yeah,
I love the spectral evidence, so you got to admit. All you said was there had to be evidence. Now you're getting picky.
It's going to be a recurring theme. And again, I say, if you want to know more about spectral evidence, the 10%. It all get charity shots. Our next case, if the Salem Witch Trials was one for the past, this is one for the future. And that's artificial intelligence and crime. It was absolutely fascinating. And when they started talking about all that artificial intelligence could do, about predicting crime and all the rest of it, it struck me a bit like the old crime pattern analysis that we used to do. Do you remember we used to do that? We used to do it with cards and graphs, but now, of course, they've got supercomputers to do with it. But the one message that came through strongly with me is that the law enforcement community have got to really get ahead of the game here, because if we're not on this bus, then we're going to be under it. We're going to be running and playing catch up, and unless we respond and unless we build systems and use them, we cannot afford to be put off by liberal sensitivities. Facial recognition, for instance, we should be adopting that. We should put in the safeguards. Of course we should, just like we've been talking about. We must step forward and we must take full advantage of artificial intelligence and all that it can bring.
A problem I see with that, Tom, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm old-fashioned. Well, I'm old-fashioned, but maybe I'm way behind the times here. And we are Police Scotland now as opposed to the old 8 forces. But there's still people look after their own patches. They guard information quite jealously sometimes. And what this needs to make these programmes super effective and as effective as they could be, because it's a fantastic tool. There's no question of that. But it's only as good as the information we put in. So what it's going to need is people putting in accurate, tested, corroborated, if you like, information and facts and figures. And if that goes in for the whole country, then these computers are capable of analysing that data to the nth degree in minutes or hours, whereas it would have taken us forever to do manually. But it's all reliant on the input, isn't it?
It does, and it slightly concerns me because I think we seem to be living in a time of falling crime. The reported crime is falling. But I do wonder about that. I do really wonder about that. When it's so difficult sometimes to get through to the police station on telephone, when the police station is closed or sometimes, knocked down, the hurdles for just ordinary reporting of fairly mundane crimes are now pretty high. But and I know that in order to have an effective crime pattern analysis, you need all the information. You need the wee bits as well as the big bits. I mean, time and time again, I've come across, while investigating sexual crime, you'll find an entry in a beat book, 3 years old, about the theft of underwear, or about a flasher, or about Peeping Tom, that wasn't thought to be worthy of report or recording. but actually it's that tiny piece of the jigsaw puzzle.
Tom, we used to go down to the briefing, the uniform briefing, if we were in, if there was nothing else going on, because it's all communication. We had a big book in the CID room at Govan, at Orkney Street, and probably that book existed at every other CID office throughout the city, I'm not sure. But in that book was just snippets. Joe Bloggs got out of prison last week and he's back living with his mum in Gower Street or whatever it might be. Just snippets. I saw such and such in the street today, along with an associate that maybe hadn't been made before. These snippets, and if you get enough of them, then when you go back and look at them, they start tying wee pieces together, don't they? They start bringing threads together. And that's really the essence of the job.
I learned very early on. I had a great mentor at DCI, Jimmy Wilson. He was a super detective. I learned from him very early on. Any squad that he ran, and any squad that I ran subsequently, I always got the best community cop, the local collator on the team. And I always got, very early in the investigation, I got the local pot books and beat books all seized, the local collators' files, to make sure there was nothing in them that gave a little clue. And it's amazing how often there was something but more than that. Even if there wasn't, it was a reassurance that you'd done the job properly.
A part of it that I loved when I was listening to the podcast, they called it anomaly detection. And that's always what you're looking for, isn't it? The thing that doesn't fit the pattern, that's an anomaly in there. And that's the big stick out for you. That's where you get the route to go down. The other thing about it that I found very interesting was about bias. And it coincided with a thing that I read a couple of weeks ago with some research that had been done with judges. And the theory, the premise, if you like, was that judges, sheriffs in Scotland, and magistrates, of course, they thought they might be biased dependent on the appearance and demeanour of the accused in the box in front of them. So the experiment was sentencing without seeing the accused. And they think that they proved, or they think that they showed a leaning that shows that there is a bias there when people are brought into the court in cuffs, or brought in prison garb, if you like, or they're scruffy, unshaven, head bowed, and all the rest of it. Then that demeanour of the accused in court can cause an unwitting bias from the judge. And that's true of all of us, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was a very bad old joke that used to circulate right through here is, what do you call a man from Glasgow in a collar and tie? The accused. But very cruel, very cruel.
You can get rid of that bias because it has no bias. It has no prejudgment like that, unless it's put in, of course.
Yeah, that's where the algorithm comes in, isn't it? That's where it depends what it's looking for. But I thought there was some super things. The shot spotter, I mean, we never lived in an environment of a lot of firearms crime, really, thankfully. But if you're living in Chicago or one of these cities in the United States where there's a lot of shootings, then that shot spotter, which could detect a firearm discharge and give you a pinpoint location, what a fantastic piece of kit that is.
And the way things are advancing, Tom, you're right, the police are going to, and law enforcement in general are going to have to really invest in training to get cops and detectives who were probably still training in some of the methods that Percy Silito brought to force in 1935. We're probably going to have to train detectives completely differently now to use these tools that are going to be available to them.
They're actually now recruiting investigators. I was just speaking to someone there the other day whose wife is an NHS investigator. She investigates things like wrong prescriptions and fraud within the NHS. And of course, it's a big, big, big issue. And she was looking seriously at an advert put out by Police Scotland, looking for investigators to come in, not police officers, but investigators who had a proven record in investigation. And that's the way it's going. But coming back to AI, I mean, I think this is so big that it's something that the National Crime Agency should be taking on. It's so big that even Scotland, which is, a large country with a big police force, 18,000 strong, I think we should be going down this road as the United Kingdom, because the investment that we'll need, the brain power that we'll need, the computer power that we'll need, the resources to bring it all together will be so great. There's no time to lose, because if we don't get off our backsides then this will get the better of us, because you can guarantee that the criminals are sitting there figuring it out right now.
And the one word you didn't use there was standardisation, Tom, across the whole country. That would help greatly, rather than we all got our own routes and own interpretation. And that would save a lot of duplication and a lot of money, a lot of resource at the end of the day. So let's have another wee advert there, Tom, before we finish off our review this week. Our fifth case, 1963, is probably the first big case that I remember vaguely about. I was 4 years of age at the time, but it was such a hoo-ha across the media, and my parents talking about it and all the rest of it. And you were talking about the film star robbers. This turned out that way at the end of the day. They became almost celebrities, some of them anyway. I was always very conscious of the driver that died as a result of what they called the Great Train Robbery. I didn't think there was anything great about it at all. Again, the media have a lot to answer for.
It was a huge sum of money. I think it was about £2.6 million. In 1963, that was an enormous amount of money.
Is it not now?
Well, not if you're on my pension. No, it's not. No. And the thing is, Simon, all you need to do to accumulate that kind of money is don't go on exotic holidays for 2 months every year. And you're fine. Not only do you not need Ozempic, the slimming drug, but you had a couple of bob in your pocket.
Yeah, I'm even a bit late to give me this fatherly advice. I'm taking notes.
I think the Great Train Robbery for me comes out squarely into category. Well planned, well executed, the most dreadful post-crime clear-out and escape plan ever known to man. A complete disaster. I mean, the funny thing is that Bruce Reynolds, he's the mastermind, and Reynolds is an interesting guy. He really is a very clever criminal. But the trouble is, he puts together a gang of people that he doesn't trust. And that's why they all went to Litherslade Farm, which is very, very close to the site of the robbery, only 20 miles. And they're all holed up there. And the only reason they're holed up there is because he doesn't trust his co-accused, because what they should have done was scattered, but he didn't trust them to scatter and not to raise their head above the parapet. But Litherslade Farm, the whole country's in uproar, and a farmer very close to the site of where the robbery took place sees a lot of activity at this old abandoned farm, which has just been sold. So the first thing he does is phone the police. Now, the question is, had it been 50 miles away, would that have been such a factor? Then, of course, the police go there, and there's been no attempt to clean up at all. There's fingerprints and forensic evidence lying all over the place, literally, all over the place. I knew a very good old safe breaker and a prison escaper in Edinburgh, a man called Hugh Kelly Mannion, one of the cleverest criminals ever came across. And he was absolutely, devastating his criticism of the Great Train Robberies. Because he said, they had this fantastic opportunity. They had the intelligence. Yeah. They had the means. Their execution was fine. Everything was fine. It was well executed. Okay, Jack Mills, that was a mistake. Violence, in his view, was always a weakness. But he said, a bunch of amateurs. A bunch of absolute amateurs. Yeah. And that's what they were.
Did you know any of the flying squad or anything like that in later life, Tom? No, it's before your time, of course. Even before your time.
Even before my time. But funnily enough, I never met Jack Slipper, but I knew people who knew him and said he was one of these... A lot of the senior detectives in the Met at that time, what they called the Big Five, they always had 5 top investigators, detective chief superintendents that would go out and help the provinces and whatnot. Jack Slipper was one of the Big Five, and there was others. Ken Oxford, who subsequently became the chief constable of emergency. So they're great guys, but a lot of them had huge egos, frankly. Slipper was not like that at all. Slipper was a very, very quiet, unassuming guy, completely methodical, very methodical. And in some senses, he was, before his time, he'd have fitted well into the Holmes generation. He'd have taken great benefit from the Holmes system and computerized systems.
Or the AI that we just spoke about, yeah.
Yes. Systems were his thing. Good systems were his thing. Of course, he was relentless. He was absolutely relentless. There was no way he was going to give up on this.
Those
On
type
and
of
on and on and on.
detectives like Jack Slipper, which most senior investigators were like, they were methodical and they were trustworthy and they were solid, and you knew exactly where you stood with them. They were good communicators, and etc. etc. But that doesn't make good telly, does it? We want to see the Sweeney. We want to see the flying squad kicking backsides and rushing about with firearms and all of that. Car chases. That's what we want to see in our telly.
That's right. Life imitates art. And I always remember, and this is true, I was told this in good authority by a very senior traffic officer, that when, do you remember Starsky and Hutch?
Yeah, of course I do.
Do you remember Starsky and Hutch? They were all racing, they were racing about in this big supercharged car and whatnot. When Starsky and Hutch came, the number of police accidents with police cars went off the scale.
A lot of bonnets. There was a lot of bonnets damaged as well by me sliding across the front of the car.
That's right. People jumping, sliding across the bonnet. No, but so life does imitate art. But you're absolutely right. It doesn't make for good television. That's why I would honestly recommend to you the program I've spoken to, Unforgotten. I don't like watching cop shows, and I don't often do it because it annoys me, frankly. But that's the exception. Very, very good.
Well, the judge in this case was Edmund Davis. They gave them 30 years. Was that the Edmund Davis that prepared the report in the late 70s into policing? The Edmund Davis report?
That was the great Edmund Davis who gave us all a pay rise, Simon. There should be a statue to him in every police station.
He changed policing, didn't he? Apart from anything else, we lost our right to strike at that point when our wages became index linked. And that was part of the Edmund Davis. No?
No, that's not true. But we lost our right to strike way back in 1919, after the police strike of 1919. The Royal Commission of 1960-61, really, that was when you had the £20 a week policeman. A beat policeman got £1,000 a year, £20 a week. And that really brought the police up to a reasonable living wage. And then the next thing that happened, 15 years later, 74-ish, was Edmund Davis. And of course, what happened was Edmund Davis was actually instigated by the Labour government. But when Maggie Thatcher came in, she implemented it straight away in full. And so in the 1970s, because the police had been losing people hand over fist to go and drive buses and all the rest of it, which was better money. And Edmund Davis put that right. And we have, unfortunately, all about peaks and troughs. And we've seen a slide back in terms and conditions. We're needing another Royal Commission.
I joined in 78, Tom, and that was the influx after the Edmund Davis report. So there was a lot of us recruited around 78, 79, 80. That was that we all lost, obviously, 30 years later when we all left in the 2000s. But there was a big gap there because there was lots of older cops that had been about for 20, 25, 30 years. But there was a big dearth in the middle there. And that's what happens when you get these peaks and troughs, doesn't it?
Well, it all stems from the Second World War when there was no retirement during the war. So in 1945, practically the whole of the police service retired. Not all of them, but huge numbers. A huge number of ex-servicemen came in. That generation was just retiring when we joined. So you get this huge bulges in recruiting and retirement. And unfortunately, in post-Edmund Davis, because there were people looking for money, we didn't always get the right quality back then in the late 70s, Simon. I'm not talking about yourself, obviously.
Tom, I've told people this myself, that when I joined, there was 120 of us at Oxford Street on a basic training course. That was double the number that you would normally get going through Oxford Street, which was Strathclyde's training school at Oxford Street, I should explain. So before you went to Tully Allen, you went to Oxford Street for 2 weeks to get your numerals and your uniform, and Mr. Duff would slap you into shape in some shape or form. I reckon in the first week at Tully Allen Police College in Fife, we lost a third of them because all you got was shouted at and bawled in your face. There was people there that normally wouldn't get anywhere near the police, but the recruitment was such that I think the recruitment department must have thought that this was going to end very soon and they had to make hay while they had permission to recruit. And they were recruiting in droves, Tom. That's the only reason I got in, perhaps, but that's another story in time.
It was while they had the money. And of course, the height restrictions were done because there was also the Sex Discrimination Act, which had come in 1975, which gave women officers equal rights. They weren't on different pay grades. So there was a lot happening in the 1970s to shake it up. There was a lot of people came in at that time, and there was a huge recruiting drive on our side of the country too. But there had been a lot of retirals. The post-war people who joined in 1946 all came up for retirement in 1976. And so they were going in their droves, and a lot of them very good people, very experienced folk. And so there was a huge dearth of...
It's something we'll cover again, Tom, especially the policewoman aspect of it, because that changed entirely in that period that when I joined the police. But we'll finish that off with a wee word about Ronnie Biggs, because he was another example of how the press can make these guys seem like film stars, wasn't it?
I know, and we kind of played into his hands. I mean, Jack Slipper went across to try and arrest Ronnie Biggs, and there was a bit of a farce. And I always wondered about that. I didn't know Slipper, but I knew his reputation. I knew people that knew him, and I don't think he'd have gone across if he thought it was going to be a farce. And I think perhaps he went across there thinking he would get access and didn't. The funny thing is, only a fraction of the money was ever recovered. That's the other thing. So a lot of it leached out the sides. And as is often the case with these cases, and you and I know very well, often the people that go into the bank with a shotgun or rob the train, they're not the ones that end up benefiting. They get the jail, and the money they've stashed under the bed or under somebody else's bed disappears.
That's interesting, Tom, especially the Edmund Davis. That was a wee side issue there. So our final case this week, our deep dive team, they've been busy this week. They've been very good. Although I did mean to say to you, there's some wee comments slipping in at the end of these podcasts that they're doing. And I think they're in cahoots with someone. I'm not sure who it might be. Things like calling me the Wizard of Oz. Things like you and I being two technical experts is how they described us after the AI episode. I can't wait to hear what our two technical experts make of this. I think we'll need to do a bit of inquiry here and find out where the source is. Our deep dive team.
They're a little bit cheeky, but I tell you what, it's worth it.
They do.
It's what a fantastic job they do. The research they do is amazing. The papers they collate, the time it must take them. I mean, I'll have to check because I would not paying them.
Our final case, Tom, Dale Cregan. I didn't know what to make of this, but I couldn't give a monkeys about him. But what a tragedy. Two young policewomen lured into his grasp and he shoots them to death, unarmed. And this hand grenade thing, it's very strange, wasn't it?
And then he goes to surrender himself. The whole thing is very odd. But do you know what struck me about this? I remember being told by an old cop, he said, any day you go out on duty, you wear the uniform. You turn a corner, you never know what you're going to face. And here were these two young women on a normal day's work. It's not as if they attend a domestic violence thing and they're unprepared. They're actually decoyed in to this murder. And this horrible person, Cregan, decoys them in. And then murders them, not only shoots them to death, but also using explosives, hand grenades, and not for the first time. Then he surrenders himself. Rather than shoot it out and face what's coming to him, which almost certainly was what would have been coming to him, he takes the coward's way and goes and surrenders himself. I think it was absolutely awful. And I can't even begin to think what's going on inside his mind. And frankly, I don't want to. He's a psychopathic killer, clearly a horrible murderer, and we should not dignify him with anything else. But it just struck me that here was a prime example of the vagaries of policing.
As well as what you're saying, Tom, because I think it was the attraction of the job to us as well, as that you didn't know you could be sitting dozing in the car in the night shift at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the next minute you could be up to your eyes in anything at all, a fatal road accident, a fire, whatever it might be. And it was that uncertainty, what was going to come across that radio, that was a big attraction of the job. But the two things that came out of this for me, well, apart from his hunger strike, big deal. I would just have let him starve to death. We should mention the victims. PC's Nicola Hughes, 23 years of age, just a young woman, and Fiona Bone, 32 years of age, and he fired 32 rounds and a hand grenade. Just absolute carnage.
Completely unarmed.
Just doing their job, going out to do their job. He got a whole life tariff. The other thing that I just wanted to finish off with that one for me, Tom, was that we've done so much in this season about the Wreath lectures, about violence, about rehabilitation, about motivation, about all the rest of it. And what comes out very clearly here, those people exist in our society out there. And there's nothing we can do about that. We just need to be on our toes and deal with them as best we can.
I do wonder to what extent they investigated Dale Cregan's background, but I do wonder whether there were intervention points before, because his violence seemed to be escalating. He'd used a hand grenade before, and I think if you get somebody who has offended to that degree, with that degree of violence and a deadly weapon like a hand grenade, then I do wonder whether alarm bells should not have been ringing before. Perhaps this is a prime case for artificial intelligence. Perhaps we need a computerized system to flash up and say, hey, listen, folks, what about Dale Cregan? You got to take a look at him.
Yes. It's a good point, Tom.
In a way, when you look at him now, you sit back and strip away the terrible violence of it, the murders he committed. He's a narcissist, he's an attention seeker, he's a gross exhibitionist. All this business about his hunger strike, it's all about me, look at me. He even, rather than die, he goes and presents himself at the police station. Again, look at me, I've handed myself in. You know, there's the real thread of that running through him. And I've no doubt, I mean, somebody somewhere will be analysing all the aspects of this man, this horrible man. But you're right, the police service is defined as being 99.9% of dull and somewhat mundane activity, punctuated by 0.1% of furious activity. And I've been writing recently, and I've written quite a lot actually, about the public inquiry into the death of Sheikh Abayu, who's a young black man who died in custody, died of ingestion of drugs, actually, while in police custody way back in, I think it was 2015. And, you know, there's a lot of wise people writing about how the police should have done this, how the police should have done that. But at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning in Kirkcaldy, 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning in Kirkcaldy, you are confronted, the police on duty, a handful of police officers, completely unprepared, are confronted with an extremely violent person, and which they have to tackle and they have to subdue. And the public are looking for them to do this. The public are saying, look, there he is there. You know, we saw him carrying a knife. He didn't have a knife when he was arrested, but he had a knife. That's a prime example of what we've just been talking about.
I read your article, Tom. It was very good. It was very insightful. Is it the big issue you're writing for now? Is that where I saw it? I always get those two mixed up.
Listen, I have written for the big issue, actually. And it has a very good circulation.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to be interviewing a man you know. I'm going to be interviewing him on the 10th of March for my radio show, Talking Walking Football. That's Mel Young. Mel Young
really was one of the starters of the football thing. Yeah,
he started the Homeless World Cup.
That's right, he did. And I remember one of the first things, because it was in Edinburgh. Like all good things, it started in Edinburgh. And I remember the Homeless World Cup was being played down in Prince Street Gardens. I remember it very well.
Good, Tom. We've had a long session today, a long review, but that's because of the job that our deep dive team are doing. They're doing a fantastic job for us.
They are. They're getting very cheeky, but we'll just have to accept that.
Wonder if we could invite them along to our live shows in the Mitchell Library in Glasgow and the Three Crows in the West End.
I venture to suggest it won't be as cheeky then. I'll tell you.
All the best, Tom. I'll be back in Scotland the next time we speak. Look forward to it.
I can't wait. And listen, if the pipe band's not there to greet you, don't take it personally. They've just maybe been diverted to something else more important. Don't worry about it, okay?
Take care.
All right.
Bye now.